Welcome to the first video in a series on how to make scratch-built horse-drawn wagons in O scale. I wanted to start by showing some finished products. Over here on the left is a wagon that's made by one of the commercial companies. It's a nice representation. If you have a lot of wagons to do for your layout, this is time effective. If you're not good with a hobby knife, it's also a wonderful option for you. I wanted to show you what we're going to be doing in this video series, and this green wagon with the red running gear on your right is one of my first attempts using this method, and this dark green one here in the back with yellow running gear is also one of my wagons. The video series was prompted by the fact that the kits can be a little bit expensive, and they lacked certain details that I thought in O scale needed to be represented. So I went and I decided I was going to make my own. Some of the features that you can see on these is we have a movable drawbar. There are movable front running gear. There's eyelet detail for hitching the horses. There's much other detail, such as a simulation of the spring seats for your rider. There's sideboards to hold boxes, toolboxes, gear boxes, water wagons, those things. And those are the things that I wanted to include in mine. So join with me and let's get started. This first video is just going to be about the rear running gear. Here's a project that I have going right now, and this one is done in styrene, but we're going to do ours today in basswood. The medium you use is entirely up to you. What do you feel most comfortable with? The thing that is unique about this technique that I'm doing is it preserves the functionality. So we have a fully swinging front fifth wheel or front joint. We have a mobile hitch bar. The prototype wagons are also adjustable. I might have submitted this. I did submit this. My apologies. But if we pull out this reach plate pin, this rear axle pin, these can slide forward and back and make the running gear adjustable to multiple beds. So we're going to work on this part today, the rear running gear. So let's go ahead and set that aside. To make the rear running gear, the dimensions are not crucial. You can do this however you like. A medium-duty wagon in O scale has axle beams and buffer beams that are about 5 feet wide. That'll make a wheelbase that's a little larger than the 4 foot 8.5 inches that we commonly associate with the width of standard gauge railroads as being derivative from wagon wheelbase, but that makes it a little wide, but it makes it easy to work. I find that if you just make these in whole foot increments, you're pretty good. So I'm going to cut 7 of those that are 5 feet long. The next thing I need are 3 pieces that are in the neighborhood of 7 feet long. And here's my O scale scale ruler so that you can see that. We're going to use 2 of these on the front suspension, and they're not needed with us now. We are going to use 1 of these in the rear suspension, and it's going to become our brake beam. And then we need a couple other pieces. One of the pieces is going to be the hitch bar, and I've made mine 14 feet long. That's variable. If you're going to have a 4-horse hitch, something in that range, maybe a little shorter. And you can size this later to the team that you have. So I've got a 14-foot, and I want a 10-foot box on my wagon frame. So I've cut this, or excuse me, I want a 12-foot box on my wagon frame. I've cut this a little long. We can adjust this later. But for now, this is 12 feet as well. So again, 7 members at 5 feet wide, 3 members at 7 feet long, a 12, and a 14. So let's set some of these aside. The first component we're going to work on now are these diagonal pieces that are called the hounds, H-O-U-N-D-S. And these are the rear hounds. They are angled, they're a diagonal support, and they keep the axle square to the drawbar. So what I want to do now is I want to just take my scale rule, and on a piece of masking tape that I've turned sticky side up, I just want to draw a square reference line. So here's my longitudinal line that represents the drawbar, and here is a line that represents the square axle beam. Let me go ahead and draw that across the rest of the tape. And now what I want to do is we're going to mark the distance out from the midline that the hound needs to be positioned. And on ours, what I want to do is I want to have the inside of the hound, the inside surface of the hound, 1 foot out from the midline of the carriage, of the running gear. So I'm now going to make 2 marks, one on either side of midline, 1 foot out. So there's my marks. Now what I want to do is I want to take those hounds and I want to lay them onto the tape. So I want to bring the hound so its inside edge is just on that 1 foot mark I made, and that the point of the hound, the front tip, inside edge, is right on midline. I'm going to get another piece. These are the 5 foot long pieces. I'm going to make sure that the inside of the hound is just at the 1 foot mark. Bring it so that the front edge is just on center line, and those 2 pieces should now be aligned. Right, they should touch tips. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our drawbar or our hitch bar, doesn't matter, either one, whatever dimension you're going to use. Yeah, let's do the drawbar, and we're going to place it right down the center line. And here's what we need to do. So that this drawbar can slide in and out of the receiver that we're going to make in just a moment, we need to cut off an angle on these hounds. So I'm going to take my chisel point X-Acto knife, place it on the basswood, and cut down. The reason I'm using basswood today is it cuts so well. This cut on thick styrene is a difficult cut to make. You have to finesse that a little bit. Come to the other side, lay it just in place, press down through the basswood. So let's pull that out. Let's remove the pieces that we've just cut away. We'll just double check this by making sure that the receiver will go into that space. It does nicely. So here's where you can see that the adjustable nature lets that drawbar go back and forth. So I'm satisfied with that right now. So let's do some other cementing. Here on the receiver, there is a metal plate that is bolted to the rear hounds, and it holds those hounds in orientation so that the drawbar can be pulled through it. Just take any old scrap styrene at this point. I have some here. It's been cut a scale 12 inches wide. I'm just going to cut a scrap off. Width isn't important because we're going to trim that in just a moment. Since I'm using dissimilar materials here, I'm going to use a little bit of super glue. The rest of the wood products I'm going to use white glue because I want it to accept stain or paint evenly. But for this one, this is going to be under some styrene, so it's not going to be such an important visual appearance. So a little bit of super glue. I want to lay the front edge of my receiver plate right out at the front edge of the wood and then secure it in place. Time to let that dry and cure, and we can trim it up in a minute. In the meantime, I want to take another 5-foot section of my basswood, and this is going to be either our axle beam, which is the beam that the axle be the transverse element that the axle will be attached to, or if it's the top portion, this is going to be our buffer beam for carrying the bed that we attach to it. Again, this isn't a highly visible element. I have the super glue handy. I'm going to go ahead and put that in place. On real wagons, this is usually mortared and tenoned into the ends of the hounds. But what we're going to do today is we're just going to lay it on top. And I want to have it centered. And I want to have it so that the tails of the hounds just project ever so slightly beyond the end of this. This will be our buffer beam or the axle beam. Just a little bit of protrusion. I just think it looks nice. It suggests there was a tenon there, a tenon and a mortise, but not really. So now we're at a point where we are going to let this dry, and then we'll return. Now what I want to do is I want to take just a moment, and I've turned the construction over, and I want to take just a moment, and I want to dress up the inside edges of the rear hounds on the front edge where they'll be on the receiver. Just dress them up a little bit. This will make sliding your drawbar in easier. I now want to take my chisel blade and I want to trim off the excess styrene or whatever you've used for your receiver plate. Just trim it off flush with the outside edge of the hounds. And there we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put another receiver plate on this side of the rear hounds. So again, just a little bit of our adhesive. And we'll put the receiver plate on. Bringing the front edge equal with the front of the hounds. Make it parallel to your plate on the other side. Another thing we want to do, we're going to now get our axle beam. On this one, it's probably difficult for you to see, but I have placed marks at the center line and then 1 foot out on either side. It's that center line mark that is going to be important for me in just a little bit. But we, again, just want to put it on top of the rear hounds, right over the other buffer beam. Good. Okay, I've turned the construction back over, and I'm going to trim off the excess of the receiver plate. And just as a test fit, I'll take the drawbar, I'll put it into the receiver, and then thread it through the axle beam, buffer beam combination. At this point, I want to make sure that it's going down the center line. So I'm taking that mark that I'd made previously at the center mark. There we are, at the center mark. I've made sure that the drawbar is centered there. And now I'm going to drill a hole for our linchpin. You can use any wire you want. Drill the hole for about the same diameter as your wire. It goes all the way through the axle beam, the drawbar, and the buffer beam. I'm going to go ahead and just snip a small bit of wire and shape that now. So I want to first just put a 90-degree angle on my brass wire. There's my 90-degree angle. I'm going to stand it up beside my construct to see how long it should be. About that long. I'll grab it with my pliers. And insert it down the hole I've just drilled. So that secures our drawbar to the axle beam and buffer beam. At this point, if I wanted to have an adjustable drawbar, I'd go to the receiver plate and I would drill another hole. With that hole drilled, I'll create another linchpin and we'll drop it down in that hole. So there we have linchpins in both the axle beam and the receiver plate. If this was going to be an adjustable drawbar, we could choose whatever interval our equipment was. And let's say you had a bed that was 2 feet shorter that you used, or a bed that was 2 feet or 4 feet shorter. Well, what you would do is you would come to your drawbar, measure out whatever the next increment was for the bed or platform you were going to mount on your running gear, and drill another receiver linchpin hole, just so that this looks like it's used for those kinds of purposes. I'm going to drill one at 2 feet and at 4 feet. That'll be visible under our bed. So there we go. So the receiver hitch will go in there. There's one last thing that we want to do, and that is put in brake rigging, if that is something you're going to do with your wagon. There needs to be a brake hanger beam. I've cut one that's 4 feet long. That's going to be this part up here. And what you need to do is you need to make sure that it's forward of your axle beam at least the radius of the wheels that you're going to mount. Now, 3.5 foot, 4 foot wheels were very common. I'm going to use a 1 inch outside diameter wheel, so it's a 1/2 inch radius. So and in 1/48 scale, that is 2 feet. So I need my brake beam to be at least 2 feet forward of the axle beam. There's my mark. If I think about my brake shoes being about 6 inches thick, it'd be nice if it was out at about 2.5 feet. That looks like a good place right there for me. So 2.5 feet. I'm going to go ahead and secure my brake hanger beam here. Square and centered. We'll let that cure. Now, one of those 7-foot sections that I made, this is going to be the brake shoe beam, and it'll be this piece right here. It's going to hang from my brake hanger beam. I want to have this be freely mobile. You don't need to have yours that way. You can wire it in if you want, make it stiff. But I do want to show you how I make the eyelets to hang the brake shoe beam from the brake hanger beam. So let's look at what I have here. I have some real fine floral wire. This is a 26 gauge. This is fairly flimsy. I think if I had to make a choice, I'd go up to 22 or 20. But it's what I have on hand, so I'm going to use it. The other thing I've done is I've taken a piece of music wire, relatively stiff steel, and I've just made a 90-degree hook that I've put into my pin vise. And then I have my rail nippers. So the first thing I want to do is I want to wrap one end of the wire around the hook that I've created in my pin vise. Press it together, but not tightly. Now I'm going to hold the end of that wire where the two wires meet. I'm going to hold that with my fine nose pliers, and now I'm going to rotate my pin vise hook until that braided, the twisted section gets almost up to the hook. It's almost closed. There's just the tiniest little extra space. And the reason we want that there is we're now going to thread this wire back through that hole. So I want to trim this off. You want to trim down inside the twist so that it's going to create a nice sharp, almost a chisel point, because we're going to use that to insert it into the wood in a little bit. So now, there is my eyelet. This is a nice way to make eyelets for other things later, and we're going to do that when we get to the bed of the construct. So now I'm going to create another half bend here. I'm going to cut this one off just to make it easier. I want to keep this on my hook, and then what I want to do is thread the previously made eyelet onto one side. And push the previously made eyelet down close to the hook itself. So again, grab my 2 open ends and just tighten. And while I have that there, let's use the rail nippers to create a chisel point by cutting through the twisted region. Leave this a little long so that you have something to work with later. So there we go. There is my eyelet to eyelet free swinging hook that we're going to use to attach and suspend our brake shoe beam. Off camera, I've pre-drilled a couple of holes through the brake hanger beam. And now what I want to do is I want to match that distance and drill a couple holes on the brake shoe beam. So just kind of centering that up, I'll find where those holes need to be. This is a number 78 drill bit. This is very tiny. It's because the material I'm using is fairly narrow. If you were to use a square profile styrene, say an 80 by 80 thousandths, you wouldn't have this kind of concern at all, but I'm very concerned about wandering out of the wood or splitting the wood. So I'm going to give this a very fine pilot hole. There we go. On the other side. This basswood is far more delicate than the styrene, which all my others have been made from, and I'm really concerned that this may be too delicate. I'm going to see if I can push my twisted wire eyelet into that pilot hole. The number 78 drill bit is just a little too small to allow me to press that in confidently by hand. I'm going to go off camera and enlarge the hole and get that twisted portion into the brake shoe beam, and then I'll come back. Off camera, I went ahead and I gradually enlarged the holes in my brake shoe beam, going from a 77 up to about a 68 in gradual steps, and I was able to get the twisted floral wire eyelets in. So now what we want to do is we want to attach it to the brake beam, but we want to make sure that we don't get any adhesive in our eyelets. You know, it'd be nice if the brake beam was free to move back and forth. So let's go ahead and turn the brake beam over. I'm going to elevate it a little bit so that there's space underneath. I'm going to take my eyelet, grab it with my pliers, apply a little bit of super glue to the twisted portion of the eyelet. And then holding the brake shoe beam in the orientation that I want, I'm going to insert that eyelet into the brake beam hole. The thing that's important at this point are two. Don't get any adhesive in the eyelets. And make sure that the eyelets are 90 degrees off in their orientation. We're getting there. hope you can appreciate that the eyelet on the brake shoe beam is open to you, and the eyelet on the brake hanger beam is parallel with you so that they can swing freely. I'm going to let this dry, and then I'll put in the other eyelet into the brake hanger beam. With the brake shoe beam now hung from the brake hanger beam, I can trim off my excess eyelet wire. And we're ready for the paint shop. Well, here we are at the end. We now have our completed new running gear, mine made out of basswood, the previous one made out of styrene. The painted colors. John Deere apparently adopted their familiar yellow and green sometime prior to World War I. I might be wrong, but it sounds like it. And they made the familiar yellow running gear. A lot of the other manufacturers, including International Harvester, used a red, and it might have been a bright red, as I've used here. I've chosen to use something a little more subdued. I've used kind of a weathered, deeper burgundy red. In my time period, prior to World War I, all of this equipment was new. These people took very good care of it, so mine will show very little weathering, perhaps some dust, a little bit of mud, but it's not going to be wholly weathered to bare wood that is gray. I hope you've enjoyed this series on, the first of a series on how to make a horse-drawn wagon in O scale. Please join me for the next video where we work on our front running gear.